Good morning, everyone. This is Dave Yanishik from the Pennsylvania OSHA Consultation Program at IUP. This morning, we have a guest presenter with us, Joe Santa, who Joe is a senior risk control specialist with PMA companies. Joe is going to be conducting a presentation regarding reducing your business's EMR. Joe essentially presented this material at the Pennsylvania Governor's Occupational Health and Safety Conference this past fall in 2020. And upon watching Joe's presentation, a group of us consultants at IUP thought, that would definitely be a great presentation for our clients in small business to see, who oftentimes will have questions about EMR, but don't have the opportunity to speak to an expert on the subject. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Joe, and he'll be conducting the presentation today.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So what we're going to talk about is how to reduce your experience modification rating. Some of you might have heard of it as an experience modification factor, but we're going to refer to it as an experience modification rating, or EMR. And by doing it properly, you'll impress your boss. So we all want to look good to our boss, and hopefully you'll come up with some pointers as we go through this to do that. Now, we will have chat open for you to submit questions, so use the chat feature for that. And my email is joseph_santa@pmagroup.com. Happy to take any questions as a result of this. Always love brainstorming and sharing information and samples and examples. And I will be talking with Dave and other members of the consultation group to help provide any additional information that comes out of this presentation. I have to give a disclaimer that this is PMA's proprietary information, so you cannot use it without permission. And I have to definitely thank David Waitman, who is a PMA consultant that when I started at PMA almost 25 years ago, he had a core presentation on the EMR and workers' compensation rating programs and insurance programs and how we could impact them for clients. And I have just been modifying this throughout the years and ran it by Dave and said, do you mind if I use your information? And he said, no, go ahead. That's if it's going to help keep people safe and help them, do their jobs well, use it. So I have to thank him. He put a lot of work over the years in this program. So our learning objectives are hopefully that you can gain an understanding of the workers' compensation insurance system and understand then how that relates to your job and how you can make a difference. And we have to understand the history of how workers' compensation came about so that we can get a grasp on where this all comes in at the end, because it really does have a big impact, and hopefully you understand that. Talk about some insurance coverage issues and the benefits that are available for injured workers, and then gain an understanding of the financial mechanics of workers' comp based on those elements to help control the workers' comp, and review strategies for reducing or controlling workers' compensation costs. There, ultimately, if we're successful, you're going to impress your boss. And we will be open for questions and discussion, and using the chat feature, you can send your questions in. So let's step back and think about the history of workers' comp. And I'd like to take you back in time to, let's say, 1902. And I'm originally from the Johnstown, Pennsylvania area. And there was a big mining explosion in Johnstown. And I thought about that scenario for this. So let's say my great-grandfather was about 26 years old at that time, and he had 4 children. And if he was in that mine, there was a terrible mine explosion, what would have happened? What was the scenario at that point in time where my great-grandmother was left to raise 4 kids, and she had to make a decision? Who's paying for the funeral? Where does the money come from? Will her 8-year-old son have to go work in the coal mine or start working somewhere else to make money to help feed everybody else? So that was essentially how the system worked at that time. The churches were very involved in helping with fundraisers. As a matter of fact, I have this newspaper clipping showing on the screen. And in a similar area in the newspaper, whenever I was looking up this example, a church in the town had said that they were taking up collections for every one of the dead miners to get $50 for their family as essentially a death benefit. And that was done by the church. So essentially what we had was a common law system where employees had to sue the employer to get benefits, or their survivor had to sue. So in that scenario that I was talking about, I guess my great-grandmother, if that was my great-grandfather who was killed in the mine, would work with the church, try to pull together money and hire a lawyer, and then sue the mine owners and hope that they'd win. So if that's how everybody was doing it, potentially there was a line, a queue to wait to see when your case would get heard. So if it took 6 years, how would you feed your family? So essentially at that point in time, the employees were not compensated and were injured, disabled, potentially unemployed, or unfortunately dead in some cases. The employer had no idea if they were going to win or lose a case, and they didn't know what costs were going to be associated with these fatalities or injuries and all that. So there was the potential for litigation and a lot of unanswered questions for everybody in the process. And it was a common law system that was used, and defenses that the employer had was the injured worker would have to would have to hold their employer liable if it was contributory negligence. So the employer was negligent, but you had to prove that. So the employer was not held liable if the worker or their survivors could not show that they were negligent. And there was a fellow servant rule. If a fellow employee caused or contributed to the injury, they were, the employer was safe. And then the assumption of risk was, these employees knew that they were going into a dangerous environment. They could be injured. They were working with machinery. Maybe it was unguarded textile machinery. And it was almost like, hey, you knew what you were getting into. And that's obviously not a very good system. And workers' compensation insurance was then developed by states. It was at the state level, not a federal level program. So in 1911, roughly, was when the early programs came into place to replace this. And it was a no-fault system. So essentially, you were provided workers' comp by your employer, and you could file a workers' comp claim for injuries. And some things had to be met that we're going to talk about. But then you waived your rights to sue your employer, which that's a good thing if there wasn't negligence, because a lot of injuries happen where they were just part of the work exposures, and they were just kind of accepted like that. But the workers' comp benefit system then would kick in, and it covered everything. It was the sole or exclusive remedy. You were provided coverage. You couldn't sue your employer. And as a result, the employees were compensated for injuries, lost wages, and medical costs. The employers had a predictable system. After some period of time when these systems kicked in place, much like our loss trend analysis now, you could say, oh, our average losses for a year are this. And maybe they had some incidents that popped up, but over a period of time, the law of numbers applied and they could figure things out. So it was a more efficient system that helped both injured workers and employers. And there are two sections in the workers' comp law. The one is the basic workers' compensation insurance that provides that basic coverage, but there is also employers' liability insurance that can kick in if there is a lapse in coverage or there is a possible leakage due to negligence that would also be provided. So we have these systems in place that have evolved over the years to cover these losses. And there are some exceptions to these, but that's a very deep topic that I'm not going to get into. But the basics here are there's workers' compensation insurance that is covered, and then there's also some employer's liability that would cover potential negligence situations. So with this workers' comp, essentially a worker has to be able to demonstrate 4 situations occurred here as a legal test. The first one is there was an injury. The injured worker was hurt in some way. In some states, it's a little bit challenging to show what that hurt was because mental disorders, stress may not be covered by workers' comp. Depends on case law and how the state has written their workers' comp law. So you have somebody that's hurt and it resulted from an accident. It was not intentional. Now, again, with a lot of these things, there's some gray area where, let's say somebody's at work like a pizza delivery person and they're robbed and they're shot. That would most likely be covered under comp because it was an accident as far as they're going. If they didn't hire somebody to come and shoot me and then we'll turn it as a workers' comp case. That's a risk in some industries that is there, that is acknowledged as an accident. And there would be occupational injuries, natural degeneration of the body or diseases would not be covered in some states, but we have an injury that's from an accident. that arises out of employment and in the course of employment. So it's related to the job. And there's even a case of employees fighting over work practices. So somebody says, hey, go get those boxes and bring them over. No, that's not my job. You do it. Oh, I'm not going to do it. And they get in a fight. That could be, there is some case law showing that it was arising out of employment. And then in the course of employment, it would mean it was an expectation by your employer. So where we get a little bit of a problem there potentially is, let's say a maintenance person is driving to get parts for something, and they think, I'll stop for coffee. Well, that's not in the course of employment, so that would not meet that legal test most likely. So an insurance claims adjuster usually runs through these 4 tests to see if it's a compensable situation. And if it is determined to be a compensable situation, the medical benefits that kick in are treatment related to the injury. That might be medications that are provided, surgery, rehabilitation, and there's no limit on the rehabilitation. You could have vocational rehabilitation, physical therapy, speech therapy, anything that's related to that injury for that injured worker, and then possibly wage replacement. So if it's determined that it was a work-related incident and medical benefits are provided, there might be wage replacement where there would be a waiting period of 3 to 7 days. And again, different states have different legal implications here as to how that's going to play out. There will also be an extent of disability that's determined by a claims adjuster, whether it's total or partial, where there might be scheduled losses, a length of disability, again, temporary or permanent. So we've got total, partial, or temporary permanent, where they're going to be paid wages, and there might be a maximum. So there is a payout potentially for a permanent total disability, and there would also be death benefits that would be paid out to a survivor. And an additional benefit that I mentioned above with the rehabilitation is the vocational rehabilitation, where the compensation system might pay for retraining for you to work somewhere else if you would no longer be able to return to that same original job that you had or that task to perform. So hopefully we have a little bit of an understanding of how there's a workers' comp system that if it meets some criteria and somebody's injured, this system says you'll be provided these benefits, and you can't sue your employer, so there's a little bit of a trade-off. But now, money's the language of business, and this is going to cost something. So it kind of leads us in understanding, okay, if we just say, well, I have insurance, would you do that with your auto insurance? If you have auto insurance, you wouldn't say, well, I got insurance, I can do whatever. It's not necessarily like getting the insurance on a rental car. Whenever you rent a car at the airport, you're like, oh, I'm just going to beat the heck out of this. You really want to take care of it because that money's the language of business, and we can't demonstrate our ability to help impact the bottom line. So we might even be seen as hindering it. Safety's not cheap, but we can get a really good return on investment with some of the things we're going to talk about right now. And many workers' compensation programs offer financial incentives. So if we show that we're doing a good job, we'll probably get better rates and better opportunities for the insurance coverage. And if we don't do well and have high levels of losses, there's going to be penalties for that. We might not be able to get insurance. Just like if you have a high-risk driver added to your auto insurance, you might have an auto insurance provider that says, you know what, we don't want to write the insurance for that, or they'll make the rate so high that it's no longer favorable for you. So here's an idea of where this comes into play with the different types of insurance systems. This is usually something that a lot of people don't necessarily know about until they've been trained on it, but guaranteed cost is the most simple insurance program. Say, hey, we have an operation here under Pennsylvania law. You have to have workers' compensation coverage. So the simplest, most expensive usually system is guaranteed cost. You say, hey, we run this manufacturing process. We need insurance. They determine how many employees you have, your payroll, what the exposure is, and they say it's going to cost X. So no matter how much loss you have, you're going to pay X. But if that insurance provider is seeing that this is very costly for them, that might not last. So you only get a couple of shots at that before maybe you have to go into a controlled program with the state or with whatever other entity is set up for that system in the particular jurisdiction you're under. Then we get like a sliding scale where they can determine, well, if your losses are above this level or below this level, here's what you're going to pay. Then we get a retention where you hold on to some of the losses and say, okay, we'll pay up to this level. And that gets really complicated because then we get into essentially like a large deductible. If you have a deductible on your auto insurance, let's say you say, well, you know, I have an older car, I'll be able to pay for my own repairs if I'd have some minor fender benders or something like that. So I'll have a big deductible and I'll just do the work myself on my car. Not something easily done with workers' comp. You could say, hey, we'll retain the first $500,000. So we're going to put all of our efforts into making sure we reduce all of these little exposures. And then if we do have a big one, that's where an insurance policy would kick in. And we work that all the way up to captive insurance, where if we're good and we're good enough, we might be able to even turn the system around that it actually pays us back money. And that's really a great way to show your boss how good safety can be. So these systems, you know, talk to your insurance provider or other safety professionals or me afterwards to get some more information. But the system gets very complicated whenever you get up into captives, and you really need dedicated people in-house to be dealing with those claims, to be dealing with rehabilitation and insurance adjusters and all the people that are involved in that. But there's a lot of reward for that if you do it right, but there's also a lot of risk, because if you would have bad losses and you're in a captive, you're paying for them. You're going to bear the burden of those costs in many cases. So let's get into this experience modification factor or rating and look at it as an understanding of, okay, based on our experience, they're going to take our premium and they're going to multiply this experience modification factor against it to see how well we're doing. And we have to think about that as a really essential part of us controlling our costs for workers' comp. But then if we think anytime an injury occurs, we have hidden costs. How much time is taken up in a supervisor doing an incident investigation, an office manager or a human resources person that has to manage claims? Or do we have somebody in the office that has to just handle that as part of another hat that they wear? Really, it affects your ability to compete with other like businesses. I'm going to really get into that with this experience modifier, because it's a great way to look at how we compare with our other like businesses. And you can't maximize your profit if you're spending more money on workers' comp and losses and these hidden ledger costs. So, not to make this too complex, your premium for workers' compensation is derived by taking a rate that's made by the state based on your occupations covered by your employees, your payroll, so we know how many workers you have, what they're making, and then we'll multiply it by this experience modification rating. Your payroll is going to be based off of figures that are provided to the insurance agent or carrier, and they're going to determine that by $100 of payroll. So let's get into this introduction to the experience modification rating. So this number is going to put you on the same level as everybody else that does what you do. So I'm specifically focusing on Pennsylvania. So if everybody is a pipe manufacturer that we're talking about here, they all have the same rate. Regardless of who provides the insurance coverage or what type of plan you're in, there is a basic rate. Then, based on your experience of having injuries, called your incurred costs, that might be lost wages, medical expenses, fees charged for lawyers that have to defend cases, your other charges, medications. And that severity is what's used to calculate the experience modification, not your number of claims. We don't want to have a disincentive we don't want to disincentivize people from reporting injuries and being really good about reporting near misses. Hey, I slipped on that ice and twisted my back a little bit. I think I'm okay, but I want to report that so that we can get something down, some sand or some anti-skid to handle that ice. We're going to base it off of 3 previous policy years, and I'll show that in a demonstration. It's much easier for me to look at it than to just talk about it. And we're going to leave the most current year that we completed with our insurance policy out of the picture so that claims can settle out. So our 2021 experience modifier is going to use the losses from 2017, 18, and 19, and 20 is going to be our cushion year till things settle out. And this is where we can really identify whether our history helps or hurts us. So if an injury occurs and somebody gets hurt, we've always got to be trying to move forward, because that experience mod is going to predict our future. So here's the calculation. We're going to take our actual losses over a class code expected losses. So they will look at the 3 years losses that have to be sent in at a specific time of the year based on whatever your renewal date is. So if you're a 1/1 insurance effective date, you have to have this information in time for them to calculate the rates and everything. And the class code expected losses are developed by the state based on all the information that does get submitted to them. So if let's say you're a roofer, your losses are X, and there is an expectation for a roofer of the same exact size doing the same roofing tasks you are would pay X. So if they come out the same, let's say it's $100,000 divided by $100,000, it's 1. So that EMR would be 1. That means that's average. You did as it was expected. So looking at this, if we are looking at last year's, what happened last year with our premium? Well, it was derived by the experience modifier that developed in 2016, 17, and 18. So this year, whether you're finishing up a policy that was a 2020 to 2021, or we're into 21 to 22, it's based off of 2017, 18, and 19, with 20 being a cushion year, because maybe people had injuries that they were on therapy or they're recuperating, and that gives time for those claims to close out. Maybe there were some open claims at the end of the policy period. So that's kind of a cushion that's in there. So like I said, if your losses are the same as what was expected or very close to it, you're going to be more around a 1, which is the average. And if a company started somebody started a new company, for the first 3 years, they would have a 1, because there's no experience to look at to see, are they going to have a good experience or a poor experience? And I do want to apologize. Sometimes I use the term bad. That's not really fair, but based on what I do, having a 1.5 is bad. And your experience was bad to drive to that. I don't mean to infer anything by that. Because we can look here and say we have a program that's effective. Somebody's got an experience mod of 0.5, which that's an intensely low experience modifier. If you have an experience mod of 0.5, you're doing something right. But let's say there's another company, they all do the same thing, a pipe manufacturer or something, and they've got a 1.5. That means they've had 3 rough years. Or maybe they had 1 really rough year and 2 moderate years. Well, let's look at how that applies. Let me put in a bar graph here to show that difference.
Hey, Joe, this is Dave. Can I stop you?
Yeah,
Can I stop you for 1 second? What are some things an employer can do to move from average to effective?
So to take your experience mod from an average experience mod to an effective mod, I like to look at things as proactive and reactive. Your proactive things are put in more efforts and more activities towards safety to stop injuries from occurring, so that you are having less losses than would be expected for your industry. And your reactive side is, it takes a while for safety programs to have their impact. So if you look at your programs and procedures to address when somebody does get hurt, your incident investigation, your return to work, you're using a list of healthcare providers for a workers' comp case, updating those programs and policies and procedures. So we're trying to prevent injuries from where we're at right now, to trying to make sure that whenever one does occur, if it does, we're controlling those costs and reducing the amount of hidden ledger costs for the people that have to work on those. Hopefully that answers that question. So
yes, thanks.
Okay, so we're moving from that average to being really good, so we can cut those costs to impress our boss. And if we are taking over a program or did have some troubles to struggle and get into that debit mod where we're into that 1.5, or we're exceeding a 1, where you're paying based off your premium, doing some things to try to lower that might be some of the things that we just talked about. So if we look at this particular organization to try to understand where their experience modifier is being impacted, let's say they had a really bad year. I try to look at things. You're going to have a blip at times, maybe in some cases, and you always got to be trying to move forward. So if you had a bad year, we got to look at the future and try to say, what do we have to do for 2020, 2021, 2022 until this 2019 drops off? we got to maintain. We can't afford to have bad years moving forward. So maybe leadership personnel don't understand that, and we've got to say we've got to sink some money and some effort and controls into stopping essentially the blood loss. Because if we look at this particular demonstration here, where remember I said a 1 is a good mod, that's average, but less than 1 is even better, and I'll show you how that plays out. But a 1.13, how bad is that? And what's the trend going to be moving forward? You know, where were you in 2020? Where are you going to be in 2021? We can help determine that by looking at those losses that we showed. So we can take something like this and look at what's 2021 going to be. Well, we had a good year of 2016 drop off of our experience and a bad year of 2019 pop on. I would fully expect in this demonstration here to see that experience mod is going to bump up a little bit. And then we need to say, let's buckle down. We've got to drive down our losses. So if 20 is currently at 13,500, that's got time for us to do everything we can to get that claim closed out, get that person back to a productive role and get them taken care of, so that let's say that there are reserves set on that for let's say it's one incident that somebody was hurt, and we say, you know, we've got to do everything we can to get them back to work and stop the lost wages that are being paid towards them and get them into a productive role. Let's say that ends up being only $5,000 after the year closes out. So then we're going to have $2,800 drop off for the next policy year, and we're going to have $5,000 bump it up a little bit. But maybe that was a rough year for our competition as well, people in like businesses. So that's all going to be taken into consideration. And those are discussions that can be had with risk management personnel and even your insurance provider. So how does this all apply? Well, let's step back and say, I mentioned before that everybody gets charged based on like industry, like exposures. So here I see, let's say we're taking a roofing company. And I use this example because I have personal experience with it, that they'll do some masonry work. You know, if we have a roofing job, you might have a chimney, you might have a parapet wall that needs repair and all that. So they might have to put drains in and work with concrete and masonry. So here across the state of Pennsylvania, the rate for roofing is $11.36 per $100 of payroll. All roofing is assessed the same rate, that 6.59 code. And if we look here, all office is a 953, and that's 8 cents per $100 of payroll. It's not as hazardous as roofing, and that should make sense. We would pay more money for a roofing exposure than we would for an office exposure. So taking this general example, we end up with $345,000 and 300 numbers are tough to say in these meetings. $345,313 of a class premium. Call it a manual premium because it's just manually calculated out, but underwriters would really call this a class premium. Then you start applying credits and discounts. So here we're saying this particular organization has a safety committee credit in Pennsylvania of 5%.
Hey, Joe, this is Dave. How difficult is it to get a safety committee certified in Pennsylvania, where a business can take advantage of that 5% credit?
Well, if you already have a safety committee in place, it really doesn't take much more effort to go through the process in Pennsylvania to get it certified. If you have a safety committee and you're taking that time on a regular basis, hopefully monthly, you really don't have to jump through a lot of hoops to get that committee certified in Pennsylvania. And it really seems to me that it should be a no-brainer, that there's a big benefit. Like, look at this right here. They're going to get $17,000. And even if it costs that much to have those meetings, if you're having them already, why not get reimbursed for it with your premium? So yeah, it's if you're doing it, go through a couple extra steps, work with your insurance carrier or a safety consultant, and just finish those final steps to get that done. So here we're looking at this particular situation where I had this roofer, and their experience mod is a 0.632. Well, hopefully you're looking at that and saying, wow, that's a 0.62. That's like unheard of. A roofer that's doing that well. This is a company I work with that they put so much effort and pride in their safety program, and having mentors for new hires, having a full day orientation training on safety and fall protection and ladder use and tool use and silica prevention, and all these things go into place. And it's demonstrated here in this 0.632. So if we take that number then and put it in here, they're taking that $345,000 premium and it's getting reduced to $218,000. And then you're going to apply your safety committee credit. So those safety efforts clearly are coming to show a benefit and helping the safety people working in this particular organization, or the risk managers, or whatever team's dealing with their safety. It's having an impact. And that's a pretty easy ledger figure to show. So when we think about that, they are a better than average experience based on their competition. And that number that I showed before, where we used a 0.5 and a 1.5, how much more affordably can they bid a job? How much more affordably can someone who has a low experience modifier manufacture a product and do the work they do? That makes a big difference in showing that viability and the benefit in safety. So going from there, we think about what we can do. Think about some of the things that we've already alluded to, and it's hard to talk about this without thinking about safety programs, hiring practices. A common term that I hear a lot with clients is we hire our problems, or sometimes I tell them that, because if we don't do a vetting process of good employees, I think the average cost for a new hire is around $4,500, depending on the job. I mean, there's a range there. But if you're going to spend $4,500 every time you hire somebody, wouldn't you want to make sure that you're doing it the right way and that it doesn't impact losses? Provide equipment, good equipment, not the cheapest equipment, but just like with anything else, you want to buy a good product that's going to hold up. And we'll talk about some of the other proactive things, but then those reactive things that we already talked about a little bit is a process. Say, you know what, somebody just slipped and fell in the parking lot. Boy, we haven't had that happen before. What are we going to do? Let's all brainstorm. Okay, we're going to put a trash can outside, a Rubbermaid barrel outside of our door that's filled up with sand or ice melt. And whenever the first person comes in, grabs the scoop out of the top and goes back and spreads it out in the parking area, so that as people arrive for the day, until somebody can get there to do the snow removal or something, we have a process. Having prompt claim reporting. Each individual insurance provider is going to have data to show that if you get your claims in within 3 days, what are you benefiting there? Well, first of all, that injured worker feels like they're not being just pushed off here. We're getting things set up. We're getting things rolling. We're going to get compensation and medical treatment for those injured workers. And I like to use the term stay at work programs. If you hired them, they had a value to you. We want to keep them at work within reason of the morality of, if somebody's seriously hurt, we don't want to say, hey, you got to come in here and work. But hopefully we're getting to the point with our proactive steps that we don't have people that are hurt that bad, that if somebody tweaks their back or something, we say, hey, if you're laying at home on a couch, you could get atrophied. We work with a physician that's part of our stay at work program to get that person back to a productive role. And while we're keeping them physically active, if that is appropriate for that situation. So we'll talk about some of these things. But to understand that stay at work program, this is another one of those areas where you can really, really impress your boss. Think about this. If a person is getting paid $100 a day, and we're going to give them modified duty at full pay for $100, are we getting that $100 of work? But if we leave them on workers' comp, they're going to get reimbursed 66 2/3% of their pre-tax wages. So can we really get $33.33 of productivity out of them if they're on modified duty? So we've got to look at that. What can we have them do that's worth $33.33? Because otherwise it's going to come into your experience of your loss ratio and your loss data. So those numbers that we showed that were applied to the experience modifier, we're driving them down if we're doing this. So could you have an injured worker do some safety activities, be a pandemic safety officer or something like that? So otherwise they're staying at home, maybe feeling like you forgot about them, maybe feeling like they're not an important part of the organization. So when we total this up, if we look at somebody who made $600, if they're going to get 66 2/3% of their wages, their weekly benefit would be $400. If they return to work for 20 hours a week, we can give them $300. Their loss of earnings from that pre-injury wage is $300. So their new weekly benefit is going to be 66 and 2/3% of that gap, that $300 gap, which would be $200. So if we think about them coming back to work for 20 hours, they're also going to get that $300 of pay for those 20 hours, but then they're also going to get $200 for workers' comp because it's a partial day. So they're going to get $500. Notice that that's only an actual loss of $100 a week based off of what they were getting paid before, to still come in for 20 hours a week and keep active and be productive and help towards their recuperation process. And they're staying in the mix. And what can you have them do? I said, maybe a pandemic safety officer. That came up with one of my clients. We were talking about, what can somebody do for a stay at work? They can do their normal work, maybe within some restrictions. Maybe they need a chair rolled over. Maybe they can do some driver deliveries. I have a client that they had a guy that injured his hand with a nail gun, and while his hand was healing up, he was able to drive. So they had him doing some deliveries to some work sites, and he did it really, really well. And all the crews were starting to say, boy, this worked really well. He ended up staying in that role, and they created this position, and now he's delivering stuff to say he loves it. He's in charge of their CDL requirements, helping maintain that, doing driver road tests, all that. And it was just a diamond in the rough for that particular situation. They could be mentored to do other roles or to help out with safety. They can do safety inspections. I have had people said, yeah, I don't mind sitting here in the shop for half a day and going through all of the extension cords that we have. And you train them on looking for nicks and gouges, and training them to be a qualified electrician to do proper repairs, looking at safety supplies, going through first aid kits, having them learn first aid, updating the safety data sheet program, updating emergency plans. We made these emergency evacuation plans for our building 20 years ago. What's changed? Well, let's look at this. Inspecting equipment, like I mentioned. And I even work with some companies that have people that are qualified to do fall protection equipment inspections as a competent person. So some manufacturers will say, hey, your harness has to be inspected every 6 months, depending on its use. So we could have this person inspecting harnesses or connectors or anchors that we use to make sure they're still good. Doing security, quality control, participating in training. It's a good time to catch up on training that might have been missed. So there's a lot of different things you come up with by working with the risk management team and other safety professionals to identify. Some more things that we might be able to do. We could have this list of 8 that I came up with, where we get senior management commitment. We got to use this stuff that we just learned to sell safety to them. Establish risk management improvement goals to say, hey, if we put these programs in place, here are goals. We want to drive our losses down. And maybe even one of those improvement goals will be driving down your experience modifier. Having manager and employee safety and risk management training programs put in place, targeting loss trends based off of experience in the past, and identifying severity exposures moving forward, define processes and behaviors, policies and procedures that we can address to try to prevent future losses, look at our claims management process, investigate incidents and root cause analysis performance to make sure that we can stop from happening again, and incorporate risk management controls, safety committees, safety audits, safety programs, some activities like that might help out. So we're going to look at each one of those individually right now. So the first one is obtaining senior management commitment. Now, I like this picture because it's kind of funny, I would hope. And we see somebody there that an organization paid money for a sign that says, don't gamble with safety. And then people are going to do something like this. Hopefully anybody seeing this knows you cannot allow a rider on a forklift like this. The only rider is the operator. So we're missing the boat on some of this stuff. We got to get leadership to buy in and have an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So the process has to be set a certain way, and we can look at a right way and a wrong way. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So there is a problem with not doing something too. There's that inaction could be very costly. So we've got to look at, if we do this process as is, what's our current losses? What are our current losses we're experiencing? And if we put this process in place, what would we estimate it's going to do to that? And if we don't, are we just going to keep maintaining that level of losses, or could it get worse? Maybe we've been lucky. And what are the estimated potential savings of any action or inaction that we do? So establishing a safety committee or putting a guard on a machine. We also can't believe that just because we haven't had a loss that one will never occur. So there has to be some I guess teamwork, brainstorming to see what could happen and what has happened. What are the net costs of savings of the action? Is there a payback period if we buy a new machine, or let's say a pallet wrapper? We have people walking around, wrapping pallets with plastic to protect them and secure them, but yet we can buy this palletizer that automatically does this. And what's the return? Well, we've had 3 people with shoulder injuries from wrapping pallets all day. Can we extrapolate out what those losses would be over 5 years, and what's our payback going to be for getting that palletizer? Can you relate to production measures? Can we say for every 5,000 widgets we make, we have $20,000 in losses? But if we put this new procedure in place, we can drive that down. What's that going to do to your profit margin? Should you position your analysis as a present value analysis, or looking at capital improvements and what depreciation is going to impact it? So we can look at bringing an employee back to modified duty, like the calculation I showed previously, purchasing a piece of material handling equipment that maybe you can raise something up to waist height from as an ergonomic improvement, or hiring a safety manager to drive these losses down. Hey, here's going to be our total cost to have this safety manager in place, and benefits for that person, them maintaining their credentials. All that has to be factored in, but what's going to be the return on investment down the road?
Hey, Joe, what are some things that senior management can do to demonstrate visibility?
Well, one of the biggest things that I hate to see, especially working with a lot of construction companies, is it really crushes what we're trying to do with safety whenever a leadership person comes out on a site or walks out on the floor of a manufacturing operation without the protective equipment and not following the procedures that everybody else has to follow. So walking the walk and talking the talk from a leadership standpoint, I think goes a really long way. And think about it, who has the guts to yell to a vice president or a president that comes out on the floor or out on a job site, hey, you can't be out here, you need to have safety glasses on, or you need to have a hard hat on? I mean, that's really, I think, the pinnacle of safety, whenever you have people that would say that to somebody, and that leadership person would say, oh man, I forgot, I'm really sorry. And instead of being confrontational or even taking that in a negative way. So I think doing what everybody else has to do and supporting that. And even whenever new hires come on board, being present to say, hey, safety's important, not just leaving it up to some mentor or somebody else who had a busy day. I think you really get a lot of weight out of whenever leadership is involved in all that process. I don't know how many have seen this type of a picture, but there's the iceberg that demonstrates workers' compensation is made to cover the direct costs. Those indemnity payments are lost wage payments that are made, and medical costs, vocational rehab, medications that might be associated with that. But what else goes on whenever there's an injury? We need to track these costs to show leadership how much it's costing us whenever we have an incident. Look at these, and this is just some. Injured employees. So let's say somebody gets their hand cut really bad at work. They're standing there holding their hand, it's bleeding. What does that do to the other workers around? And then somebody has to clean up the blood. And I know that sounds horrible, but that's reality. If you have a supervisor, they have to fill out an incident report. Safety director has to get involved. Is somebody transporting that person to a hospital? Well, if they're standing there bleeding, we're calling 911, I would hope, and using first aid practices to control the blood. If somebody is hurt in some way that it's not an emergency and they're going to be taken to medical treatment, we should never let them drive themselves. What if they faint in the process from pain and they wreck and it's even worse, or they wreck into somebody? Everybody's down. Oh man, did you see Bob? His hand was really bloody. So everybody's standing around. We're not having productivity. Equipment might need repaired. Customers are waiting for that shipment and it's not coming now, or now we have a spoiled product. They've got to clean things up. Schedule's delayed. People say, I'm sick of this. That's a 4th person I've seen get his hand cut in the last month. I'm out of here. And they quit. We got to retrain. There's overhead costs. We might have lawsuits involved where we have to defend, and the workers' comp costs are going to be increased because of that. And we can estimate that indirect cost, that hidden part of the iceberg, is going to be 4 to 50 times higher. And you can even do, I have a sample of an incident investigation form that has where you would estimate what your costs are for all of these different things. And then you can go to leadership and say, hey, we had this loss and our loss runs for the insurance company. It's a $12,000 loss. But here's what I estimate those costs were to us because of all the things that went on. And they say, wow, we thought it was a $12,000 loss, but it's really costing us $60,000. What do we have to do to make that money back up? So you might use something like this that you can calculate out what those additional costs are to truly show that depending on the types of incidents, it could be 50 times higher. And if we look at what profit margin is for your organization, that could be a very thin thread to failure. If we take our loss, divide it by our profit margin, we can determine how much revenue we need to generate to make up for that. So if we have an accident that's $1,000 and we have a 1% profit margin, we have to make $100,000 because we're only getting $1,000 for every $100,000 of product that we sell. So if you have a higher profit margin, you can make it up a little bit more easily. But how many of your clients are going to be willing to pay more for a product? You can't just write out and say, you know what, we had $100,000 in losses last year, so we're going to figure out how to make our profit margin go from a 1% to a 5%. So we only have to sell 2 million of our product instead of 10 million. It doesn't happen that way. So we always need to be driving those costs down so that we can make a proper amount of profit to cover replacing equipment, benefits increases, insurance increases, real estate increases. So for an example, if we have a $1,000 accident that's not paid for in full until a company has a 3% profit margin, selling $33,000, 334 to replace that lost money. Well, those profits were already spoken for most likely. So now we're losing, we're playing catch up. So this is a great way to sell to leadership. Hey, we really need to drive our costs down. Our average accident is costing $25,000 or it's costing $5,000. And you can extrapolate it out to see how much you have to make and sell additionally to meet your goals. So a 2% profit margin, $5 million in sales, we get $100,000 profit. So that might cover $100,000 in losses or an insurance premium rate increase. If your Fetzer valve is sold for $1,000, you need to sell $5,000 to cover that one claim. So you need to make $20 pure profit on each one, and X amount are going to cover whatever your average losses are. So a really good practice to help impress your boss is to have a risk management cost allocation, to say, let's measure and allocate what it costs to do things the right way to control losses. Our performance bonus is tied to production or profit. And we need to be very careful how we format that, because if we're going to say, hey, we're going to give bonuses to everybody that comes in, under this level of injuries and dollars out the door for workers' comp injuries, and is that going to encourage people to take vacation whenever they're hurt? We don't want to see that. You don't want that to happen. And thinking of the scenario where you have somebody that they always come in under on the job. Let's say it's a construction job and they're putting up they're going to put a patio on a house, and every patio they put on, they save money. But in the meantime, 3 people are hurt every job they do. You're not saving any money. Are you putting those factors in as part of your cost allocation? Our safety insurance costs measured and allocated to the cost of jobs. Okay, every time we do a patio, we have to pay $1,000 of insurance for our workers. And we looked at Bill's jobs, and boy, he's costing us a lot more. So we need to allocate that. What gets measured gets done. If we say to our workers, hey, here's what our costs are, we need to drive them down, here's what we need to do, and here's what we expect it's going to cost from an insurance standpoint, the right people are going to drive it down. They're going to do what's necessary, but we got to give them the tools to do it. So charge and allocate those insurance costs based on profit centers, locations, departments, and we can determine, what we need to drive our safety efforts and our risk management efforts to help drive those down. Think of a roofing company. We might have a crew that goes out and does repairs, and we might have a crew that does all new rooftops, and we have another one that's doing replacement roofs. Which one of those do you think has the most risk? we can't just stand here and we could look at their losses. But for me, I would think the harder job would be a maintenance crew of 2 people that have to go out, set up a ladder, go up on a roof. Somebody's got to be a monitor. They have to put fall protection in place. And that's very challenging if you have a bunch of roof leaks you got to get to in that day. We've got the driving to many more job sites every day. So we'd have to look at that and assign those costs to it. Maybe capture those insurance costs and look at the profit compared to what the losses are. And ensure performance bonuses measure that profit, not just simply production. We want to look and see, what did that job cost? If we had a lot of injuries doing that patio, like I mentioned, we're not saving any money. So we've got leadership involved, we demonstrated them the benefits, and then we establish goals. So I like proactive safety goals, like how many training sessions did employees attend? How many toolbox talks do they participate in? How many of your people are participating in a stretching program every morning? Maybe you're doing safety audits, and if that department gets a 90% minimum score, that's pretty good, because we're nitpicking. We're going through with white gloves. Number of hazards corrected by individual workers each policy period. Number of safety suggestions. The percent reduction of identified problems. And they have to track this on their own, and we have to have some trust involved to do these. And then we have to look at training, having people understand what is required. I like to use this example. There's a link here for this publication from OSHA. It's the training requirements in the OSHA standards. This is 256 pages. 270 pages long. And about 100 pages of it are general industry requirements. So if you have a manufacturing operation, you have 100 pages of training requirements that you have to consider. And what quality of training is it? Are we doing training to meet obligations? Are we doing it to really help our employees know what they need to do?
Hey, Joe, this is Dave again. And I know you had mentioned this earlier, but could you just kind of retouch where employers could go to have their safety committee members trained?
Well, if you have a safety committee in Pennsylvania, the workers' comp law allows you to get certified if you meet certain requirements, and the insurance carriers are supposed to provide personnel, professionals who can provide the services to support your risk management. I think it's actually called accident and illness prevention efforts. So the insurance company should be providing that. If you can't get it through the state, or if you're in the state's insurance fund, you can get the Department of Labor. They have a PATHS program that's really good, PATHS. And they have training available, but your insurance carrier should be able to provide that training as part of their requirements. And just as a follow-up to that, there is supposed to be training every year, and I would recommend, you're going to get the most out of it, whatever you put in. So the more training you do for safety committee, if you're going to have a topic each month, I like to do a little mini training topic each month on whatever hazards are. If we know, oh, we had an injury to this, let's do a little mini training topic or a toolbox talk or something like that to go with safety committee. Because again, there are eyes and ears out there in the workplace. The next thing would be to target historic loss trends. Here I just pulled up a chart with a group that I work with, and we saw 66% of our injury costs are related to strains. So where do you think we put our efforts? There's only so much that we can do in a day. But here, if we targeted strain, sprain, and slip, trip, fall, we could really drive losses down. So if we look at those trends, break it down and see how many of those things are really preventable, I bet we find a lot are. Maybe this is the 66% of those injuries. We look at the big ones and they were all in our shipping receiving area. And we say, wow, boy, we've lost a lot of money there. What if we get a vacuum lifter that we can put in here that it picks up the boxes and it's got a trolley above us? Yeah, it's going to cost a lot, but what's one back injury costing us? We can break that down and really justify how to manage the severity of our claims. And that brings us to looking at what's recordable versus compensable. They're two different systems. OSHA is a federal agency whose rules apply to businesses to say, we have to keep track of these and put them on an OSHA log. And then there's workers' comp, which is a little bit different. That's a state level program that we're participating in. Like in Pennsylvania, you must have workers' compensation insurance, and it's usually provided by an insurance carrier, or you can be self-insured, but you have to meet state requirements. And you're going to have insurance coverage to cover those, but that doesn't mean they're one and the same. Workers' compensation being paid does not necessarily mean it's impacting your OSHA recordability. Some cases may be OSHA recordable and not compensable. Some may be compensable, but not OSHA recordable. and some cases may be OSHA recordable, but not compensable. So there's just this whole thing that you need to have an understanding of how it applies. They're two different things. And there are some cases where you could have a workers' compensation claim that is not OSHA recordable. OSHA excludes from its understanding of work-related, non-listed circumstances, like when an employee is injured doing personal tasks. I mentioned that maintenance driver that's out picking up parts and he stops off for some coffee and he hurts himself, slips at the restaurant or at the mini mart. Participating in a volunteer activity, acting in the role of a member of the public, suffering from an idiopathic condition or illness, and parking lot injuries. Whether any of these circumstances would be compensable under workers' comp, it's separate from OSHA. You might want to talk to OSHA. You can call them and ask them, or you can talk to your claims adjuster to see if they have any insight. Now, I know at my company, we don't answer whether something is OSHA recordable or not. That's going to be, we can give guidance, but we won't tell you one way or the other. That's good. We don't want to have that liability for telling you and it's wrong. So I guess you can always err on the side of caution and put it on, but I would talk to OSHA and your workers' compensation carrier.
Hey Joe, could you give a specific example of an incident that may be compensable but not recordable?
And that parking lot one is really the one that jumps out most to me. If you had a worker coming to work, until they punch the clock, they're not covered normally under workers' comp. But if they would slip and fall in the parking lot, a lot of times workers' comp carriers will cover that under comp because there's a cap on compensation. It's doing you a favor, really, because if they would file a liability suit for being injured in your parking lot, there's no cap on that. Who knows what would happen? They have to get a lawyer. They have to show loss. They're going to come at you and say you were negligent in some way. And that's a case where they could sue their employer because it's not related to work. It's related out of the premises. So that's one that we would usually try to help our client out and make it compensable. And again, every case is different, but a lot of times that's where I would see that. In a parking lot, somebody fell before they even punched the time clock, get them under comp. It's better for you as an organization than having them on liability. The next thing we'd do is try to define processes and behaviors. So looking at, I mentioned previously, hiring practices. We're not just getting warm bodies. We want to make sure we get people that are going to be helpful to the organization moving forward. Don't hire your problems. Purchasing processes, making sure that everything's going through a purchasing department that meets safety requirements. We don't want to buy processing materials for our tasks that are flammable if we don't have to. We want to make sure we're getting safety data sheets. That should be part of purchasing. Everything comes through one department. Engineering procedures to make sure that we have the process is engineered out to make sure that we're eliminating the chance for loss. Maintaining and cleaning our facilities, doing preventive maintenance instead of breakdown maintenance, having good access and egress. You know, right now it's winter in Pennsylvania. We've got a lot of snow and ice. We should have a main walkway that's clear. I work with a lot of construction sites and people are walking all over the place. If we have a clear walking path with gravel down or sand, pardon me, we can, control those icy areas because otherwise they're walking through snow and ice. Looking at our process flow to make sure that it fits in and it helps control injuries that might occur, having an area that maybe gets closed off because we've had injuries in the past, or putting up guards or even light beams that if they're broken, the machine shuts down. And doing periodic reviews of the process and the losses and even turnover of employees at all levels. And I'm sure you could come up with many more different things that you could look at here. And then
Hey,
we
Joe,
get into, yeah.
Can you just give one example of an interview question that an employer could use to evaluate a new candidate's tolerance for risk?
Well, one that I think is a good one, and I've used this in training as well, is what's the most dangerous thing you've ever done? Think right now, everybody that's listening to this, what's the most dangerous thing you've ever done? I mean, the perspective on that could be really, really varied. But when you got somebody that's talking about, I've had some people say, using that as an icebreaker, oh man, I've shot propane tanks. You should see what happens. It's like, oh my goodness, why would you ever do that? So I even had a guy that has a scar on his face, and he said, well, I guess getting this scar on my face, and I wasn't about to ask, and he was very willing to share it, that he had pulled a woman from a burning car. And there was news articles about it, and everybody there at the organization knew about it but me. And I was like, wow, that's a guy I want to work with me. And he probably is a go-getter, but he's willing to risk himself. So let's make sure we get him good safety training. So hopefully that answers your question, Dave. But what's the most dangerous thing you've ever done? That could probably give you some good insight. Next, we look at the claims management process. This is after there's been an injury, controlling the costs. So this is very reactive, but we want to make sure that we get that first report put in as quickly as possible. That's going to help control our costs. The claims adjusters will determine compensability. The claim will be indexed, payment will start, a reserve will be set. If we're going to expect to lose wages, there will be indemnity payments. There might even be associated fees with doing medical evaluations. Then if it's going to be a simple payment, it's a med only, claim gets closed out. But then if it's going to be lost time, there's going to be more costs, and we need to work on keeping that person at work. Number 7 would be to investigate incidents. I like to call them incidents because most things that happen aren't accidents. We can look at our history and look at trends, and we could say roofers fall, roofers cut their hands if they're doing metal roofing. And I like this phrase here: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. If we keep doing the same thing over and over again, it's just going to keep happening again. And we can't make minor changes for incidents to go away. If somebody slips and falls on the ice, what do we need to look at? We need to say, why is there ice there? Well, it's Pennsylvania. Well, okay, well, we know it's Pennsylvania and it can be snowy and icy. So can we do something about that? Can we have a process in place? Well, we have a company that we contract to come in and remove our snow and ice. And it takes them a while to get here because they hit 3 other businesses on their way here. Well, we need to do something about that. Then the first person that's in is putting down sand or anti-skid materials, or we pass out traction devices for people to wear on their footwear. But some of this might take brainstorming, and it might not be, yes, we're going to do that right away, but we need to strive towards that. Otherwise, it's just going to keep happening over and over and over again. And then we incorporate additional risk management controls like the safety committees that were mentioned already, and getting it certified to get that, not only having the benefit of the committee, but having the benefit of a discount on top of it because we can meet state guidelines. Have safety audits that are performed regularly and periodically and by everyone. Don't just wait for a safety professional or a department head to do it. Everybody should be auditing constantly. Having more safety programs is identified. Who would have thought a year ago that we would be saying, hey, let's have a hazard assessment for pandemic controls, and let's put these steps in place, and doing drug testing and having incentive programs and other creative ideas that people could brainstorm and come up with.
Hey, Joe, real quick, you had mentioned incentive programs there. Could you give an example of what would be maybe an acceptable incentive program? Obviously, because OSHA frowns upon disincentivizing employees from reporting injuries. So what would be something that would be acceptable?
You've heard me mention proactive and reactive as I've done this presentation. I like to think of safety programs that are leading indicator supporting, not lagging indicator supporting. That's a popular term we hear a lot now. With lagging indicators are, gee, we've had a bunch of injuries this year. That's already happened. It's ancient history. Whereas leading indicators are, hey, what are we doing to make sure that we don't have injuries in the future? So that we drive that experience modification factor down and down and down. So right there, I love incentives where we give somebody an incentive, whether it's monetary or it's a jacket or a hat. And I like clothing and stuff with our logo on it because that can be tax deductible. Talk to your tax people. But things that are based off of proactive steps, like we have a safety training topic every month. So that's 12 months. But gee, Carl went to 14. We have, we offer 2 a month, but you only have to attend 1 a month. And if you attend extra, do more. Hey, one of our departments put in a stretching program. We're going to give them an incentive for that. I had a long-term care facility that I work with that they put in a requirement for slip-resistant footwear. And they paid everybody $50 towards their footwear. But no different than, like I mentioned before, my daughter works at Starbucks and she has to wear slip-resistant footwear. If If she doesn't show up with that, she can't be at work. It's part of the uniform. So I went around with the president of this company like 3 months after the program was in place, and we walked around with gift cards from a local quickie store and gave out cards to people who were wearing the slipper system footwear. We didn't give out a whole lot of cards. That was because people weren't wearing the footwear that the company paid for. What do you think happened the next time we went out? People were wearing them. So that was a good incentive, and it was a good way to get results that we really needed to get. People wore them at first, or they dragged their feet, literally, not buying the proper equipment. So I love incentives that reinforce good behaviors, not, saying, oh, if we don't have an injury, well, sometimes luck and fate gets involved. And that's what we're trying to do with these 8 steps, is to reduce the likelihood of that luck and fate. And sometimes an incentive program that supports extra activities, doing more training. Hey, we got a foreman that on a construction site that they're supposed to do weekly toolbox talks, but we know his crew, they do daily toolbox talks, and each one of the crew members has to come up with one each day. So at the end of the day, the foreman says, Carl, tomorrow you're on for the safety topic, figure something out tonight. And with smartphones, it makes it so much easier, but I've actually had those happen, and it works really, really well. So how do we reduce the EMR and impress your boss? Hopefully we understand those leading and lagging indicators. So, whoa, sorry about that. My slide jumped. And we look at, okay, once an incident occurs, that's too late. But what are we going to do to try to be proactive and prevent those things from happening? And then we can do some things to control those costs if they do happen. Look at short-term goals versus long-term goals. A short-term thing might be, boy, if we've had some eye injuries, let's have everybody wear safety glasses. And long-term is, we're going to put a guard around this machine so that stuff doesn't fly out and hit workers. Change culture, get those leaders involved, and explain this, share a presentation like this with leaders so that they get that understanding. Somebody that decides I'm going to run a company might not have ever had the experience modifier, and the impact of loss is explained to them. They're seeing, I've got this great idea and I can have a business that's going to succeed. Consider it as only one measurement. There are better ones. You could look at claims frequency. You can do program audits and say, we've got these things in place, but we've got these gaps. Look at the number of training programs you do, and look at your training. What's your orientation like? Do you hit people with so much information that they can't really absorb it? And then they go out hitting the floor and they really don't have any idea. They don't even know where the bathroom is. But I know where the safety data sheets are, or I know what a safety data sheet is, but I still don't know where the bathroom is. So we got to see how that all ties in and understand all those factors. So with that, I think I ran through everything I wanted to. Dave, you got any questions or?
No, that's it. Obviously, everybody there can see Joe's contact information if you'd like to contact Joe directly. If anybody logged a chat feature question, we will capture that and post it on our website. Hopefully a lot of those Joe is able to answer during the presentation for you, but if not, we will definitely get those questions answered. And then Joe, if you just like to advance to the next couple slides, we'll just show everybody our OSHA consultation contact info. There you go. So everybody that's on the webinar has probably seen that before with prior webinars. The next slide, Joe, will just show a screenshot of our website. That's where you as a client could go to put a request in for free services. And the last slide, Joe, will show, obviously it's a thank you. I want to thank Joe for agreeing to do this presentation for us today. Thank all you folks for participating. We are planning on doing another webinar on April 14th. We're still developing the topic, so we will be sending an email out about that one and when we have the topic and we have the date firmed up. So that's it, everybody. Thanks a lot. Appreciate your attendance.